What's up, guys? It's Bromley, and I'm back answering some questions from the question and answer portion from last week. This is our Patreon exclusive series where we answer questions directly from you guys, give them their own videos. These videos are going to be live here before they're live anywhere else, and we're going to keep them here for some time before they get released to the general public. So that's part of the perk of being a Patreon subscriber, is you get to see this first. Sorry, I have to interpret this a little bit. This question came from Danny Arp, who's asking the best program for an intermediate who is too lazy to learn how to program himself but has to train 2 to 3 hours a day. So I'm not sure if this is a typo or not. I could read this two different ways. I could read this as best program for an intermediate who is lazy to learn how to program himself, or best program for an intermediate who is too lazy to learn how to program himself. I'll answer both because they're both valid questions. Let's assume that you don't have the time or the desire to really fiddle around with all of the obscurity that goes into learning how to program, because you can absolutely get lost in the weeds. And a lot of this stuff you end up going over is minutia. It's trivia that you won't really know how to apply it until you come across that bridge. So you can actually get a lot of very reliable, productive growth by just finding a template that addresses those issues. You don't necessarily need to be an absolute nerd for all things programming in order to benefit. And actually, sometimes that can even be a distraction. Some of you guys, if you're like me, you get paralysis by analysis, where it's almost like the more you know, the longer it takes you to make a simple training decision. And that can be a problem just as well. So sometimes ignorance is bliss. So assuming that you don't have the desire or the ability to learn how to program, you have a couple hours a day to train, several days a week. What is the best program? What is a lazy programmer's program? Well, it's got to check a few boxes. For one, there's got to be a few variables. The more variables there are in a program, the more complex it is, the more attention you have to pay to them, because making proper training decisions means selecting, isolating for individual variables. You can't be changing all things all the time. That doesn't work. So more variables means more complexity. So a program you're going to want to look out for is one that is simple. It has all of the key elements contained in a few things that are easy to see. The progression is simple. It only has few exercises. It doesn't require frequent rotation of exercises. It doesn't have a lot of different moving pieces. So few variables is a key hallmark. The second one is that the progressive overload has to be obvious. So that's another variable that's going to drive progress. It's going to be how you progress week to week and month to month. That has to be simple. You have to be able to see it. You have to know how your numbers change, and you have to know what to watch out for when you need to deload or reset or whatever the program might have involved in it. This encompasses pretty much every ebook that's ever been written on the subject, because that's what sells. 531, Juggernaut, Cube Method, Fifth Set, whatever it might be, they all have their built-in progression that's kind of the hallmark of that program, and people associate those numbers and those percentages with that program. They're very easy to get a handle on. You can see how the whole program is put together on paper in just a few seconds. So that's what you want to look for. Obvious method of progressive overload. Example of a program that doesn't have an obvious method of progressive overload would be something like any of Shaco's templates. When you look at Shaco's templates, all of the work and the changes are built into it, but it's not obvious when you look at it. You have to sit down and calculate every single working set. You have to trust that the way the program is written out is going to take you through the ebbs and flows of work that's going to get a desired result. I've been doing this for a long time, and even I'll look at some of the Eastern or Soviet methods of training, and I'll look at it, and it is not obvious what is going on week to week. You actually have to calculate out all the numbers. Westside is another example of what doesn't have an obvious method of progressive overload, because the driving force, the primary driving force, is going to be the max effort work that rotates every week. So the variation that's built in is the changing exercise. Well, you have to be good at picking exercises. You have to make sure they work out the way you expect them to, but there's no prescription for increasing the work ahead of time. It's not like you're doing a certain amount of volume this week and you're prescribing set increases in that volume week to week. You're just hitting the heaviest single you can and hoping that you get stronger by the time you come back around to that main lift. Similarly, for the accessory work, they give recommendations on the number of sets and total reps you're supposed to do at each one, but they don't give a prescription for how that is supposed to progress over time. The driving force is supposed to be effort, which is not very cut and dry, and it's not very reliable. So the third thing is something that can be ran indefinitely. Now that's an important one, because if you're not going to be paying attention to the finer points of programming, you're not going to be doing a lot of tweaking and fiddling. That means you need to be able to get your work in, write it down, jump to next week, and after you do that so many times, you have to know what your next move is. The easiest thing to do is to just cycle through it again. Simple linear progressions are the way to go, because they are very easy to follow and adhere to, so compliance is high because they're not complicated. You can run 531 indefinitely, and then you get to the point where you can't run it anymore, you reset and build back up. Same thing with starting strength or the Texas method or any other of these linear progression type programs. Juggernaut is another example of something you can run indefinitely because it is basically a linear periodization scheme with a 3-week wave structure. So it has variety. It has the ebbing and flowing from week to week. It'll go from higher volume to higher intensity, and it does that several times within the entire cycle. But by the time you get to the end of it, you plug in your new max, you run the cycle over again, and that's essentially what periodization is. That's just a very easy to follow, very cookie cutter way of doing it. So any of these programs are going to do what you want them to do. Now, the other consideration is going to be what is going to have the appropriate workload, what's more appropriate for you given where you are. He says an intermediate lifter, so you're talking about somebody who's decently strong but isn't maybe quite competitive yet. At that point, you need to understand where you are likely to fall in as far as your ability to handle work. You're not quite a novice, so you can't progress on a day-to-day basis. You have to go week to week or every other week. Programs like 5-3-1 do a good job of spacing the amount of workout without being so spaced out that you're likely to detrain. I cited the cube method. I really like the way Brandon Lilly put that together, but my instinct is that that's a little better for more developed lifters, just given the way that you separate the amount of work really far apart. The way it goes from heavy to volume to recovery, that might be unnecessarily spaced apart. That's not to say it won't work for you, but as an intermediate lifter, you can get a little bit more out of every progression week to week. So I would look towards something that is a week to week progression, something that only has a few exercises as the staple, that doesn't rely on a bunch of accessories or variations, because again, those are more variables you have to keep track of, and something that has a very obvious reset point. You get to this point where you can't continue on, and then you go back to the beginning. I hate to say it, but one of the most straightforward methods of progression is going to be 5-3-1. 5-3-1 is very simple. You're hitting a top set at 85%, next week is 90, then 95, then you reset a few pounds heavier and continue. So every few weeks, the amount of work you're handling is going up. The progressive overload is obvious. It uses intensity, uses effort as a driving force, and it gives pretty simple recommendations on what your other movements should be. Now, if you really want something simple that is even easier to follow than that, I actually really like the Grayscale LP. Now, this is something some of you might be aware of, some of you might not be aware of. I like the Grayscale LP because it is simple, it meets all of these boxes, and it has a little bit more volume associated with it where 5-3-1 doesn't. Now, 5-3-1 makes up for that with accessory, but if we can remove that level of complexity, you're going to have something that's a little more straightforward and easier to adhere to. So it relies a little bit more on the role of the main lift as the main developer instead of something that you do some work with and then pad it with a bunch of other work. So again, if simplicity is what you're going for, this is something that works very well. So the Grayscale LP is actually something that is very simple to run. I don't know if enough people know about it or been around. I want to say it was 10, 12 years ago that Johnny Payne had his website rolling. He runs a gym out of Philadelphia, I think. And I think he actually had some connection of Ripito back in the day. So Grayscale LP is essentially just a reimagining of starting strength, except it's different in a couple ways that I think is very valuable and very beneficial. So what we stay with regards to starting strength is a 3x5 structure. We alternate pressing and bench pressing. So if it's 3 days a week, then the next week would be bench press, that alternates. So you say with 2 squatting workouts and 1 deadlift workout. Now the way that it's different is that there is a little less frequency than starting strength, where you are not squatting every single workout. You are just squatting twice in the week, deadlifting once. The set and rep scheme is the same, but also the difference is that there's a plus set at the end, meaning you're not just doing your minimum 5 and then adding 5 pounds. You're doing an AMRAP set at the end. So it adds an element of intensity. It adds that element of trying to chase what you did before. And it's very productive, especially if you haven't ran something like this before. It's a little higher frequency, which means you're not going to rely on a lot of accessory because it's not really sustainable. If you're doing 3 days a week of upper body, 3 days a week of lower body, you're going to do less total work within that time. Now, you'll actually be surprised to see how devastatingly effective this is, because it does look like it's very low volume at the start, but it's actually plenty of work for most people. I actually ran this as an intermediate lifter. I was close to a 600-pound squat, and I was actually able to run this with good success for a period of time. So if you want to learn more about it, go ahead and Google the Grayscale LP. They make recommendations for other movements, back extensions, bicep curls, simple stuff to incorporate that's not going to detract from this. But I'm a big fan of this setup. This is a good way to hit all of your bases in as few moves as possible. You're doing the 4 big lifts. I believe rows are thrown in at some point, curls are thrown in at some point, but the method of progression is painfully obvious. You can run it for a very long time, and then when you get stagnant, you can reset or you can move on to something that is a little more advanced. But I like Grayscale LP because it is extremely simple, it's effective, it has a good mix of volume and effort, and you can run it for a long time. Obvious progressive overload, few variables, can be ran indefinitely, can be cycled through each time. So this is a good way to put it on autopilot. Now, if you are looking to kind of get a handle on programming or level up into something that is a little more complex, then you want to start looking at things that have a few more variables. And then you want to start moving up incrementally in terms of complexity as you get a handle on how each one contributes to the workload and you learn how to kind of maneuver them around each other. So the next logical step in complexity is going to be something that moves you through different thresholds at a more aggressive pace. So now you're looking at longer periods of training progressing linearly. So instead of week to week or day to day, now it's every 3 weeks or every month you start to move up. So that requires more of an attention span, more record keeping. I'm actually really partial to Juggernaut because it is a very kind of simple, straightforward, linear periodization scheme. You do a period of 10s and then a period of 8s and then 5s, and you get all the way down as if you were going to peak for a meet. It works very well, but it has kind of a wavy structure that ensures that most people can recover from it. But it also features an AMRAP set every 3rd week. It does a good job of moving you back and forth in the short term between volume and intensity. So it has some other elements, but learning how to start light and then progress heavier over time, that is a feature of linear periodization, and it's something that you're going to want a template to follow a few times before you try branching out on your own. And that does a good job of getting your feet wet. So if you want to start to learn how those more linear methods work, that's an option. Now, I would obviously be remiss if I didn't recommend Base Strength, because Base Strength has plenty of templates that are very easy to follow in terms of their progression, and it lays out all of the variables for you. And many of them are just as simple as this is, where you just start with a certain number and then you just add a set amount of weight periodically and then cycle through on a predetermined schedule. So that takes all the guesswork out. So Base Strength is different because it's not just the program. That's not the ebook. I give a lot of programs and a lot of examples. The book is meant to cover differences between different phases of training and what the logical move is after so much time spent doing one type of training. What variables can you look at and how can you manipulate them to switch it up? As everybody knows, if they've been working out for more than a day, you got to switch it up. The question is how. So that starts to introduce ideas and philosophies into how that progressive overload changes and how the movement and the stress and the recovery changes. So Base Strength has a bunch of templates that are super easy to run. So if you are a lazy programmer and you want something that has the right amount of complexity but is very easy to implement and follow in a cookie cutter structure, you can look through the Bull Mastiff template. We have a high frequency template, one for heavy, medium, light, one for DUP. So depending on what flavor you're looking for, what your frequency is like, and how much variety and complexity you want, Base Strength has you covered, so go ahead and check that out. Now, there are obviously a ton of programs out there. The fact is, if something has a sustainable amount of work week to week, if it doesn't kill you with its rate of progression or the amount of work that it prescribes, and if it progresses evenly over a set period of time, you're going to progress. Just marrying stress, and as stress increases with recovery, allowing enough recovery to actually grow. When you find that balance, just about anything you do works. There isn't a magic amount of volume or a magic way of approaching exercise selection. It's just about setting a baseline of work and moving forward. So anything you commit yourself to is going to work. So when in doubt, like I say, keep it simple, stupid. So that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. Leave questions and comments in the comment box. If you've encountered any simple methods of progression or very easy programs that have paid big dividends, go ahead and let us know. Go ahead and leave it in the comment box. Until next time, thanks for watching. This is Bromley. I'll see you.